Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the second session of the day, and we have Dr. Anandita from IIT Hyderabad. If I may formally introduce the speaker to you, Anandita teaches in the Department of Liberal Arts, IIT Hyderabad. Her areas of interest are feminist theory, gender studies, and Dalit feminism. She is the author of Mapping Dalit Feminism Towards an Intersectional Standpoint, published by Sage 3 in 2020, and Aesthetics in India, Transitions and Transformations, published by Orion Black Swan in 2023. The title of her talk is Justice for Whom, Gender, Caste, and Intersectionality. May I invite Dr. Anandita, please?
So thank you, Atul, for this wonderful, and very kind introduction. And let me first begin by expressing my immense gratitude to Professor Nair and Professor Kurian for inviting me to this wonderful event. I've been listening to all the talks, and it has been really encouraging and also interesting to listen to so many texts and contexts. So I believe that idea of versatility and intersectionality, also taking from the previous conversation, is very well captured, not just in the way in which we talk about text, but also in the way in which we select some of the themes. So today's talk is, my talk is on social justice, and the talk is titled "Justice for Whom, Gender, Caste, and Intersectionality." So for my first talk, it will be a bit more theoretical sort of talk, and the second one I have shared the text with you, text and the film. So the second talk will focus on the textual analysis, so to say. Okay, so now when speaking on the topic of justice relating to gender, the first question that we need to begin with is what gender is justice? Okay, so in a meeting, ABA meeting actually, Linda R. Hirschman asked, is the law male? Hirschman's question pointed how the maleness of the legal system affects every woman in the country. The law determines who is secure in both person and property, and women are secure in neither. The world of law, she concludes, is an affirmative action program for white males. Really makes us think, not only in the Western context, but in the Indian context as well. Now, the complex dynamic of gender and justice is perhaps most tackled in discussions on law. Mary Becker noted that the first efforts to rid the law of gender bias resulted in simply allowing women to be treated like men. And this is when we are talking about the earlier forms of equality and other sorts of things, when we are going for women's voting rights, when women were seeking rights to be equal participants in votes, just like men. Martha Craig Daughtry said women bring an otherwise unrepresented viewpoint in the courts, though one woman is not enough to get the job done. Daughtry referred to a case where a woman sued a construction company for negligence when two men used a duplicate key to enter her home and rape her. Daughtry said that her fellow justices, all male, found the rape regrettable but not foreseeable. Women, on the other hand, understand immediately that there was negligence and that the rape was actually foreseeable. Why else lock the door? The observations surrounding the case highlight the bias in perception, which then gets translated into formal language of law. But who is the subject of justice, and who are these women? Now, today's talk on gender justice, I'm going to focus on the lens of intersectionality to emphasize on the necessity to recognize the interconnectedness as well as differences among categories. I will first address the issue of injustice through the thematic scope of violence. From there on, I'll go on to explain how intersectionality can prove to be a useful framework of analysis to understand injustice meted out to Dalit women and the ways forward. Now, in contemporary theories, gender justice has been discussed in various ways. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, for example, offers a framework for thinking about justice in terms of what individuals are able to be and able to do. According to her, Justice requires that individuals have access to the resources and opportunities necessary to develop and exercise their capabilities. Real freedom, in this sense, means that one has all the required means necessary to achieve that doing or being if one wishes to. That is, it is not merely the formal freedom to do or be something, but the substantial opportunity to achieve it. And this is one of the discourses or dialogues pertaining to the reservation policy as well. Now, this means addressing not only economic inequalities, but also social and cultural barriers to gender equality. Nancy Fraser distinguishes between two dimensions of justice: redistribution and recognition. Redistribution includes the fair distribution of resources, while recognition refers to the need for cultural and social respect for marginalized identities. Gender justice, Fraser argues, must include both the redistribution of economic resources and the recognition of gendered identities. For example, women and LGBTQIA individuals often face both material disadvantages and disrespect or marginalization of their identities. A comprehensive approach to gender justice must address both forms of injustice. Further, transfeminism also expands the scope of gender justice to include the experiences of transgender and non binary individuals. It critiques the binary understanding of gender that is often implicit in both mainstream society and some feminist theories. Transfeminists argue that justice must encompass the rights of all individuals to define and express their own gender identities free from violence, discrimination, and coercion. This includes addressing issues such as access to gender affirming healthcare, the recognition of non binary identities, and the dismantling of rigid gender norms. Now, when talking about the question of gender and justice, violence often takes a front seat because it's often the immediate form of discrimination that we get to see. Now, such theorization often follow two trajectories: physical and sexual violence, and there are also more implicit forms of violence that have mental repercussions as well. Now, we have to remember that often all these things actually occur side by side. The spaces where instances of violence take place can also be varied. According to Cynthia Cockburn, since gender power shapes the dynamic of every interaction, violence is also closely linked with such gender notions and practices. In feminist theorization, gender violence has been analyzed in two ways: the male female binary, in the sense of how the sexual difference between two genders lead to different violence targeted at individuals. And the later researchers have also opened up newer spaces for analysis wherein violence is targeted at groups who do not fall in the normative gender roles. Now, what underlies the basic concept of violence is the use of force. In fact, we can expand the concept of violence even further by asking what are the legitimate forms of violence and which are not. Now, while talking about gender and violence, there are two terms which are often used: gender-based violence and violence against women. And the reason is most violence against women is inflicted for gender-based reasons, and such violence affects women in a disproportionate manner. I'd like to quote from the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which defines violence as any act of gender based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of acts such as coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. Now, in the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, Article 3 offers the following definition: gender based violence against women shall mean violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman or that affects women disproportionately. And in all these cases, we see that the focus is on the identity specifically of a woman. Now, what this kind of violence does is it creates an imbalance of power and disadvantages the non dominant individual or group. Such violence is also rooted in specific social and cultural structures. Moreover, different groups, experience violence differently. And as I said, the forms of violence can also be varied. Now, violence, as I said, is perhaps one of the most visible forms of oppression. The 1993 Canadian Panel on Violence Against Women stated, "Women will not be free from violence until there is equality, and equality cannot be achieved until the violence and the threat of violence are eliminated from women's lives." Now, in the post independence period, if we take a look at India at this moment, feminist movements in India have been vocal about different kinds of violence meted out to women. The issue of violence against women became one of the most prominent themes in Indian feminist movements in the aftermath of the 1974-75 Towards Equality report. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about this report. So, the Towards Equality report was one of the foundational sort of reports on gender violence, or maybe the condition of women in India. And the reason why this report was formulated is because 1975 was announced the Year of Women by UN. So all the countries were instructed to prepare a report in this regard. And funnily enough, or maybe not surprisingly at all, the report found that women's condition in India have deteriorated since 1911, since before independence. So the report was, sort of shocking moment, and it resulted in also the flourishing of 33 women's centers in India across different universities. So UGC opened these centers. So it also marks a somewhat formal entry of feminism in the academic sphere, the report. The increase in, moreover, this is also the time when we have issues like, Manushi and other organizations taking up issues of domestic violence, marital rape, dowry deaths, and so on and so forth. So the question of body and women's right over body, choice, all those things are becoming gradually important. So Indian feminists questioned the structure of family and demanded legal redressal of domestic violence, dowry murders, rapes, and so on. The question of marital rape also destabilized the notion of Indian family. Additionally, the resurgence of the custom of sati or widow immolation, especially through the case of Roop Kanwar, raised newer concerns about violence against women in the contemporary socio-cultural sphere. Now, Gail Omvet, in her book Violence Against Women, New Movements, New Theories, gives the reference to the Nari Mukti Sangharsh Sammelan organized in Patna in February 1988. This conference raised significant points about women and violence. The Nari Mukti Sangharsh Sammelan, in their resolution, writes, women face specific forms of violence, rape and other forms of sexual abuse, female feticide, witch killing, sati, dowry murders, wife beating. Such violence and the continued sense of insecurity that is instilled in women as a result keeps them bound to the home, economically exploited and also socially suppressed. Their resolution argues that violence plays a major role in keeping women suppressed and economically exploited. Now you can see how family and once again the material aspect of family is linked very closely with each other. So the question is how how does this sort of nexus plays so well? Firstly, we know that there are patriarchal systems obviously operating in the society which dictate that women should stay within the house and under the controls of their male members, specifically fathers or husbands. The domestic confinement already leads to the lack of economic opportunities. Since women do not get any opportunity to get trained in a profession, they have no choice but to go for low paid or unpaid forms of labor. Such suppression keeps women in their propertylessness and resourceless situation. Their economic dependence leads them to being subjected to domestic violence, abandonment by husbands, lack of voice, and so on. The patrilineal patrilocal family structure also does not give women access to property most of the times. Now, we have to remember that women's deprivileged situation originates from their gender identity. And this is where intersectionality becomes important, because when we talk about violence on women and the forms of justice, uh, we need to also recognize which category of women we are talking about. So, the concept of intersectionality is very interesting. It challenges traditional notions of justice that treat social categories as separate or distinct. So, intersectionality emphasizes on the need to, or the necessity to, recognize interconnectedness as well as differences among categories, as I said earlier. Intersectionality calls for an approach to justice that acknowledges how various systems of oppression intersect and compound one another. Achieving gender justice, therefore, requires addressing these interconnected forms of oppression in a holistic way. The concept of intersectionality was, in fact, popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw. Although I have to mention that the thematic, framework of intersectionality has already been in play since, much longer, especially with the theorization of women of color. So Kimberly Crenshaw, talks about intersectionality from the legal point of view, and it posits that individuals experience oppression and privilege based on multiple intersecting identities, including gender, race, class, sexuality, and ability. So, a woman of color, for example, might face both, oppression faced from the mutual or intersecting forms of race and gender. Uh, and this is why we cannot really look at gender and race as single axes of oppression. We need to see the specificity that it creates in oppressing black women or Dalit women. That also creates a difference, between black men and black women, or white women and black women. Okay, so there is a layered sort of understanding that intersectionality is really preaching. So it emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s from the legal academy with a view to develop a single framework for analyzing power that encompasses and connects gender, class, and race based subordination. The notion of intersectionality, as I said, arose from the criticisms of feminists of color, which focused on triply oppressed black women. As Kimberly Crenshaw argues, a single axis framework treats race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience. Intersectionality rejects the single axis framework by embracing the various ways in which race and gender interact to shape the multiple dimensions of black women's experiences. Now, Catherine McKinnon actually puts it very interestingly. She says, I quote, intersectionality as a method in the sense focused here does not simply add variables. And we'll talk about the problematics of additiveness as well. It adopts a distinctive stance, emanates from a specific angle of vision, and most crucially embodies a particular dynamic approach to the underlying laws of motion of the reality it traces and traps, while remaining grounded to the experiences of classes of people within the hierarchical relations. Patricia Hill Collins, in her article Black Feminist Thought in the Matrix of Domination, gives prominence to the term intersectionality to describe how oppression is shaped by interlocking structures of domination. Collins argues that with respect to thinking about oppression, Black feminist thought has fostered a paradigmatic shift because it rejects additive approaches to oppression. It does not start with gender and add race, class, sexual orientation, etc. Rather, it focuses on how these structures intersect to oppress different kinds of people. Now, in this sense, intersectionality proposes a very valid and lucrative methodology for feminist analysis by proposing multiplicity of approach and by challenging the homogeneity so far assumed by either feminism or anti-racist discourses. Its transformative aspect lies in the fact that it captures not just the static outcome of reality, but the dynamics and lines of forces as well. Jennifer C. Nash provides three purposes of intersectionality. First, it subverts race and gender binaries by putting the subjects and their experiences at the center of the overlapping margins of race and gender discourses, which further complicates the theorization of identity. And second, unlike identity politics, intersectionality approaches intra group differences. What do I mean by intragroup differences, or what does rather Nash mean by intragroup differences? Intragroup differences refer to differences within groups. So, for example, if there are categories such as women or black or Dalits, it would look at women based on differences in terms of race, caste, religion, and so on and so forth. So, intersectionality critiques conventional feminism's emphasis on either creating sisterhood among all women, which is homogeneity, and speaking for them, or differentiating and ignoring distinctions based on race, ethnicity, class, etc. In other words, ghettoization. And thirdly, intersectionality provides a unique opportunity for the scholars to investigate multiply marginalized subjects by juxtaposing apparently mutually exclusive frameworks. Now, at this point, I think it's important to also talk about how does intersectionality really function? Do we keep adding different structures one after the other? Will we be more aware if we keep adding things? So let's say we begin with race and gender. Okay, let's add class. We are a bit more aware. Let's add something else. Are we a bit more aware? And so on and so forth. And this problem was identified by Nancy Ehrenreich, who talks about it or calls it as an infinite regress problem. Now, Leslie McCall actually identifies a solution for this in her article Intersectionality as a Method. So she says that the point is not, identifying how plurality or multiplicity is really going to be so, make us very aware. The point is to look at the process. Okay, if I, to go back to what Patricia Hill Collins also says, how these structures intersect, the process through which these structures really intersect. So, this fear of too many categories then can be easily overcome if we see specifically, let's say, if you are talking about, we will go into the issue of caste and gender soon. Let's say black women, instead of looking at, taking up individuals and then seeing how more oppressed they are, the idea is to look at the structures themselves. And for example, if we are beginning with, let's say, black women and the structures of race and gender, we will also have to be open minded enough to see that during the course of investigation or exploration, if we come across the differences, that create a much more nuanced understanding. So the idea is to look at the process, not necessarily to go for additive sort of sense of terms, so to say. Now, Mary Matsuda suggests that intersectionality works by enabling scholars to ask questions. She writes that way I try to understand intersectionality is when I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Now, while this framework seeks to understand how patriarchy, racism, and heterosexism function together to oppress a certain group of people, it also sometimes can be seen as ignoring the ways in which subjects may be both victimized by patriarchy and privileged by race. Generally, intersectionality, and this is a criticism towards it, has excluded an examination of identities that are imagined as either wholly or even partially privileged. Now, Jennifer C. Nash also argues that intersectionality can overcome these criticisms by analyzing race and gender both as constitutive processes and as distinctive and historically specific technologies of categorization. To end with McKinnon on this topic, it is not their identity that is problematic or problematized, but the consequences of how they are socially identified and hence treated. So, intersectionality challenges traditional notions of justice that treat social categories as separate or distinct. Instead, it calls for an approach to justice that acknowledges how various systems of oppression intersect and interact with each other. Achieving gender justice, therefore, also must include the awareness of difference within it. Now, how can this framework be useful in discussing gender and justice in a way that becomes more receptive of differences? I'd like to elaborate, on these through two cases. One is the Mathura rape case, and another is the Bhanwari Devi rape case. Now, in discussing rape, feminists in India have identified not only the violence on women's body, the lack or loss of agency, the legal gaps, they have also talked about rape both within and outside the house. For example, marital rape and custodial rape. Now, at this point, it's also important to remember that systematic rape also takes place in the form of genocide, where violence against women is directed to destroy entire communities or ethnicities. Rajeshwari Sundararajan, in her work Real and Imagined Women, talks about the many ways in which rape has been conceptualized in feminist theory and activism. The very act of rape, she notes, is an expression of male sexual domination. It is therefore seen as one of the most visible and ultimate forms of patriarchal oppression that completely robs women of any agency over their bodies. Feminists have also tried to locate the issue of rape within a more complex intersectional sphere where they recognize that patriarchy is not the only structure of oppression in society and that privileges and handicaps are heterogeneous, distributed unevenly among categories of both men and women. Now, in the West also, so while talking about the rape, we can also take a look at, how it is theorized in the West. So in the US specifically, criticism against rape has broadly, focused on the idea of compulsory heterosexuality by challenging the issue of institution of marriage. They have also promoted gay liberation movements, the resistance to harassment of women in workplace, protests against child molestation, etc. Predominantly, US feminism has focused on the individual pathology of the perpetrator and the violation of individual rights of the victim or survivor. In India, the situation is a little different, although they do take up lots of similar issues. So, feminist criticisms of rape in India revealed it as a systemic issue that often stemmed from and impacts a group. Thus, most of the cases of reported rapes are institutional rapes in the hands of the police, army, landlords, upon women of oppressed classes and castes. As Rajeshwari Sundararajan mentions, rape as a phenomenon in contemporary India is more properly understood as the expression of male violence sanctioned by various modes of social power rather than sexual desire. Now, the issue of rape is also taken up by Radha Kumar in her seminal book, History of Doing. I would highly recommend the book. Please go and read it if you haven't already. So, she says that the issue of rape has been one that most contemporary feminist movements internationally have focused on. Firstly, because sexual assault is one of the ugliest and most brutal expressions of masculine violence towards women. Secondly, because rape and the historical discourse around it reveal a great deal about the social relations of reproduction. And thirdly, because of what it shows about the way in which the woman's body is seen as representing the community. Now, these movements often focus on two forms of rape: institutional and class based oppression. Now, in the form of, or in the category of institutionalized form of rape, custodial rape has also gained prominence. Feminists have pointed out how women become victims of mass rape, which often function as acts against a community or a class, which is engaged in a struggle with those who hold power over it. Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi comes to mind in this context, or as individuals belonging to marginal groups. Now, I'd like to begin with the Mathura rape case, which took place in 1972. Now, it took place in Maharashtra, which generated a huge uproar on a national scale. In 1972, Mathura, a teenage Adivasi girl, was abducted by policemen and raped at the police station. The premise of this case was following. Mathura, she was an agricultural laborer. She fell in love with the cousin of her employer and they decided to marry. So they eloped. Her brother, however, complained to the police that she was kidnapped by her lover. They were all brought to the police station. The police brought them to the police station, and after recording their statement, when they were leaving, The police had held Mathura back and told her brother to go back. Later at night, when her brother came back with others in search of her, Mathura said that she has been gang raped by the police constables, and after much pressure from the crowd, a case of rape was registered. Now, the policemen, very interestingly, what follows, and this is where we talk about the language of law. The policemen were actually acquitted by the Sessions Court on the grounds that Mathura had voluntarily had sexual intercourse with the constables, and the justification was that she had a lover and therefore she was already a licentious woman. The court blamed Mathura for crying rape to prove her innocence. Although on further appeal they were found guilty by the High Court, but the verdict was again reversed by the Supreme Court. Now, this judgment prompted lawyers such as Upendra Bakshi, Raghunath Kelkar, Lotika Sarkar, and Vasudha Dhagamwar to write an open letter challenging the logic of consent applied in making the judgment. The Forum Against Rape, which is also known as Forum Against Oppression of Women, FAOW, a feminist group based in Mumbai, came across this letter in 1980 and decided to start a campaign for reopening the case. The Mathura rape case brought the concept of custodial rape and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1983. Now, the reaction to such legal measures were multifaceted. On the one hand, some were happy that the sensitive matter of rape was finally getting some legal recognition. Now, the feminist groups such as Lawyers Collective and the Stree Sanghars also demanded the scope to be extended to all cases of rape and not just custodial rape, because in most cases, rape was considered proven only when physical signs of forcible entry was found on the woman's body. Feminist groups, on the other hand, argued that other forms of rape be also recognized. There was also another controversy regarding burden of proof clause, where the accused would be presumed guilty till proven otherwise. Now, this created the fear of misjudgment, intentional accusations, and so on. Now, and the Mathura case is significant not just because of the recognition of custodial rape, but it also has latent caste gender implications, intersectional implications. Mathura was an Adivasi girl, and her presence in the public sphere, due to her job, along with the fact that she was unmarried and had a lover, branded her as a loose hypersexual woman. This assumption made her sexually available and also worked as a reason why the Sessions Court gave such a judgment. Her case highlights the prevalence of caste sexist assumptions. Now, in their book From Mathura to Manorama, Kalpana Kannaveeran and Ritu Menon point at the intersection of caste gender to understand the following terms. Gender within caste society is defined and structured in such a manner that the manhood of the caste is defined both by the degree of control men exercise over women and the degree of passivity or complicity that of the women of the caste. By the same token, demonstrated control by humiliating women of another caste is a surefire way of reducing the manhood of those castes. And this is perhaps most visible with the Bhanwari Devi case as well. Spaces, domestic and public, are similarly structured along lines of caste and gender. And here Kannaveeran and Menon actually established the premise of absence of Mathura's family members, especially male members, in the police station. And they argue how it demonstrated a control and humiliation by the police constables, which led to the control over her entire family and community at large. So, such interpretation highlight the act of humiliating women of another caste through emasculation of lower caste or Adivasi men as a process that is also linked with caste oppression. The observation invokes castes to see the specificity of patriarchy. And this intersectional analysis shows how it is the Brahminical patriarchal assumption of a lower caste woman's sexual availability that makes Mathura susceptible to custodial rape. So, the Mathura rape case and feminist agitation against it is significant for another reason. We cannot homogenize the category woman as a group who is universally affected by one kind of patriarchy. In fact, based on the caste, class, religion they belong to, different groups of women face oppression differently. This realization also raises other questions. Who can speak for whom, right? One of the classic questions that we have encountered with Spivak. Feminism, whether in the West or in India, has often promoted the cause of either white women or upper caste women. We can only see, the 19th and the early 20th centuries are evident to us. In the process, black women and lower caste women have often remained in the margins. And even when they are talked about, a lot of times they are relegated to stereotypical images of victimhood. This is most visible in the ways in which First World talks about the Third World. The former assumes to know about the latter because of their locational and political hegemony. And this is what Spivak terms as speaking for or on behalf of someone. And such representation fixes the marginalized women into stereotypes and does not give any space to their voice. And this similar anxiety is also reflected in the Mathura case, especially the way in which FAOW or the Forum Against Rape dealt with the case. So, when members of the Forum Against Rape met with Mathura for her opinion on presenting her case in a campaign on the International Women's Day, Mathura did not object, but she was not hopeful of its outcome either. This led to the realization that they had gone so far into the campaign without ever trying to understand what the subject or Mathura truly felt like. On the one hand, it raised question about the assumed supremacy that mainstream feminists often exercised regarding marginalized women, and on the other hand, it raised more painfully complex question of the impending stigma that might be brought upon Mathura after the case gets prominence once again. The anti rape laws underwent a major change in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya rape case in Delhi in 2012. As per the recommendations of the Verma Committee, the 2013 Amendment Act was promulgated with amendments in sections 375 to make laws against rape and sexual assault more stringent. Now, let us take a look at the Bhanwari Devi rape case. Now, Bhanwari Devi again was a Sathin in the village. Sathin literally means friend. Village in Rajasthan, who was also part of the Women's Development Project (WDP), run by the government of Rajasthan. So, Sathin was a term given to a grassroots worker like Bhanwari to showcase their contribution to the society. Her work included taking up issues related to land, water, literacy, health, public distribution system, and payment of minimum wages at famine relief works. Some significant moments of intervention were, for example, in 1987, she took up the issue of attempted rape of a woman from in a neighboring village. And in 1992, she stopped the child marriage of a 1-year-old girl child. And it was this last incident which actually worked as a catalyst event against her. Child marriage was widely practiced in that area and was considered to be a matter of caste pride. So, when Bhanwari, a woman belonging to a lower caste group, stopped the child marriage of a 1-year-old child belonging to an upper caste family, it caused trouble. As retaliation, she was raped by 5 upper caste men in front of her husband. Now, why is this case so significant, and how do we see gender, labor, and caste being interrelated? So, interestingly, once again, let's go back to the verdicts. The district court ruled the case as baseless. Okay, it ruled it baseless on the grounds that upper caste men could not have raped a lower caste women because lower caste people are untouchable. So, why on earth upper caste men would even touch her? The case was primarily represented as a case of gender violence, which then led to the famous Vishaka guidelines of the 1997 on women's sexual harassment at workplace. Now, this transition is also very interesting. Feminist groups connected this case to women's sexual assault at workplace, and the interpretation of the issue presumed the category woman to be a homogenized whole, wherein sexual harassment was assumed to be operative similarly for all women with same intensity. Mainstream feminism, therefore, viewed women solely through the single axis of gender and erased caste altogether. Now, Bhavri Devi is, a classic example of violence against Dalit women who participate in social labor. uh, Both the approaches, now in case of Bhavri, if we take a look at both the feminist approach and the way in which the verdict was also formed, both of them ignored the fact that Bhavri Devi was gang raped in public due to her participation in village panchayat, and she knew the knowledge making processes. Now, the analysis of the court verdict would also underline its Brahminical vocabulary. That is, the incident is impossible because she belonged to a lower caste and therefore is an untouchable. Brahmanism justifies accessibility to rape, accessibility of sexuality of lower caste women because of their participation in social labor, while at the same time indicating the lower caste men's failure to protect their women. And going back to what I was mentioning earlier, the idea of emasculation. This assumption stems from the stereotype that women are the society's honor, and therefore women who stay within the domestic sphere are pure, and those who step outside the boundaries of the space are visible in public sphere are often associated with immorality and sexual availability. So, this interpretation strategically disregards the whole lot of lower class and lower caste women who are visible in public sphere and engaged in different kinds of professions. It imposes one type of model for women to follow, and this is why we talk about Brahminical patriarchy and not just patriarchy alone. So, in the absence of adequate focus on the links between caste and gender, the Bhavri Devi case remains closeted within sexual atrocity. Now, while it is interesting to note, going back to the Vishaka guidelines, as I said, post Bhavri, actually, we had Vishaka guidelines that brought about a transition in terms of women's harassment in the, workplace. Now, while it's interesting to note the impact the Vishaka guidelines had in bringing about new direction in feminist articulation in India, in the process of its formulation, it also erased an important aspect, that is the origin of its guidelines. And the case continues to be unresolved. So Bhavri Devi case shows that when we are talking about women in workplace, there is no one category of women. Different groups of women belonging to different castes, classes, and so on face sexual harassment differently. Through Bhavri Devi's case, just to reiterate, we can see how sexual violence is used not only to punish the lower caste woman, but it also serves as a cautionary note to the entire Dalit community. It is for this reason that it's important to recognize that the structures of labor and gender and caste are not equal and similar for all women. Now, while analyzing women's concerns, various dimensions therefore need to be considered. We cannot have a blanket policy for all women because their situations are different. An intersectional analysis would challenge the binary of caste gender, which is often done in Dalit and Savarna, feminism, by arguing that Dalit women as a category needs to be reconstituted within the patriarchal relations of graded caste inequalities. Catherine McKinnon, in her article Intersectionality and as Method, investigates spaces where vectors of inequalities intersect. Rather than universalizing a knowledge, intersectionality recognizes the differences and particularities. She, we can connect her example of genocide in Bosnia with the public rape of Dalit women. McKinnon points out that the destruction of the women of an ethnic community through rape was recognized as destroying their community as such. Genocide was not marginalized. Instead, women were made central in its more capacious frame. Now, in the context of Dalit women's rape in public, it often serves as a scope for upper caste men to prove their caste and gender superiority over the lower caste men and also to control the lower caste women. This intersectional reading not only offers a different analysis of the issues but also underlines the hegemonic tone of law which compartmentalizes these issues as simply caste or gender atrocity. The analysis, now to conclude, of the cases shows the pitfalls in the legal system. It shows us that rape cannot be understood simply as sexual oppression or violence. It has deeper links with different systemic structures and also affects different groups of people differently. As the examples showed, there are deep seated caste gender implications underlying the rape and the verdicts. Following the usual method, feminists in India actively work towards bringing about social awareness and legal redressal. Rape most of the times go unreported because of the social stigma and puts the blame on the victim or the survivor. Intersectionality, therefore, is useful in not only highlighting these lacuna, it also forces us to acknowledge the question of justice that needs to be specific and that must incorporate the differences in a way which is not divisive but has the capacity to be conscious and politically aware. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pan, for that fascinating talk. I'm sure there'll be questions and responses among the audience.
Hello, ma'am. It was just such a nice and wonderful presentation, and I'm glad to be here. And my question is, all the way you have talked about feminism, and whenever one talks about feminism, there automatically a term comes patriarchy, and patriarchy is always triggered, and this should be done. But before I ask my question, I would like to say a few words from a story, The Girl Who Can Buy a Mat I Do. So if we look at the story, then we can see that there was a girl called Ajua who was 7 years old, and she was born with long and thin legs, and that is why she was criticized, and the criticize was not done by a male, but the criticize was done by a female, and the female was of her grandmother. And by writing this story, Amata Aidu is actually trying to portray the matriarchal system. And my question lies here that don't you think that for the subjugation of women and for the domination of women, the way a male person is responsible, similarly a women figure is also responsible, and they go side by side?
Thank you so much for the question. You have like hit the nail at its at the center itself, I would say, because this is a burning question when we talk about feminism. Now, I always like to begin my classes on feminism and gender with the idea that feminism is not about man hate or it's not about hating men. Feminism talks about patriarchy, right? And patriarchy is specifically a system. This is what Gerda Lerner and others have talked about. So, when we look at patriarchy as a system, the example you gave actually fits perfectly. We will see that the people who practice patriarchy are not just men alone, so to say. We also see women as agents of patriarchy. Look at all the Hindi serials, right? Mother-in-law daughter-in-law fight is the classic quarrel among people. We You must be familiar with the film Water as well, right, where we see that the widows are actually in Kashi are controlled and exploited by the female matriarch who is over there. So the question is actually very valid. So instead of saying it as that's where I have also have problem with the term matriarchy, because it kind of replaces patriarchy again, regenerates the hierarchical situation, and it's not necessarily equality oriented in that way. So so the way I would like to talk about it is how women also become agents of patriarchy. So Nivedita Menon, in her book Seeing Like a Feminist, begins the book in a very interesting way, where she says that in contemporary times, when we are talking about makeup, okay, the entire effort is to look as if you are not wearing any makeup at all, right? So why even put on makeup if you want to say you haven't put on makeup at all? So our external appearances, our thoughts, values, everything is impacted, like you very correctly said, by social patriarchal structures and family, household, especially elder women, going back to remains of the feast. So very interesting story actually. So how older women become the reasons to create a scenario for younger women to follow, and that is also equally patriarchal in nature. So I completely agree with you on that.
Thank you,
Thank you.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. Uh, so, what intersectionality basically looks at is like the various relations of powers. So, it's like kind of like whatever Foucault said, like as far as I remember. But what like can we incorporate any method of organization in this process? Because after textual analysis, what next? So, how does intersectionality view organization of various groups against uh, patriarchy, imperialism, capitalism, whatever? So, what is that method?
Right. So thank you so much for the question. In fact, intersectionality also engages with power relations and the various ways in which I would say, structures are really intersecting with each other. Okay. And we can always, like the examples I gave, right? So, see, for example, if we take a look at, if I understand your questions correctly, so you're talking about the how the organizations or the alternative voices are looking at specific cases and what next, basically, after doing an intersectional analysis. So the biggest outcome of an intersectional analysis would be to really, propose a completely different viewpoint, which would not have been there. Okay. Now, when we talk about intersectionality, as I said, it's mostly imagined as a theoretical framework or a process. Okay. So intersectionality is often used as a methodology to analyze and understand different events, cases in different ways. Okay. A next step, and this is also one criticism against intersectionality, because the argument is that it heavily depends on identities. Okay, we are looking at gender, caste, and so on and so forth, and looking at the experiences of people belonging to those specific groups. So, are we really remaining, closeted within identities, so to say? And then, how do we reach awareness? Because if you are remaining at the level of methodology, okay, analysis level, then how can we really propose answers, like you said, right? What are the possible ways of going beyond it? And many people have actually proposed feminist standpoint theory to be an answer to it, because feminist standpoint theory by Sandra Harding. And there are many others. So Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, Dorothy Smith, they all talk about standpoint. So the idea of standpoint, or feminist standpoint, basically, is that it takes inspiration from women's experiences, but it also is very much self-reflexive in nature, where it looks at the position of the researcher as well. Okay. So, when we are talking about intersectionality, we are necessarily looking at how privilege or oppression works. But what about the position of the speaker, right? We talked about Spivak, who speaks for whom. When Forum for Against Rape is talking about Mathura, and Mathura is saying, okay, I'm not really comfortable with this anymore. Please don't talk about me. I have suffered enough. Then the Forum Against Rape is also thinking, okay, did we really need to revisit this case or not, right? So, feminist standpoint theory also provides that very crucial information about, the position of the speaker, and to analyze how they also come from positions of power, privilege, or oppression, and so on and so forth. So, you can think of intersectionality perhaps as a methodology, as a process, and a lot of times, you can go back to standpoint theory to provide that very aware sort of answer. I hope that made sense. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, a lot of times this intersectional understanding, and this is also going back to identity politics, also, right? They take a lot of inspiration, whereby people facing either, going for or originating from similar kinds of identity groups, or people facing similar kinds of oppression, often come together and create an alternative view. I'll give you an example. So we'll talk about it when discussing Writing with Fire also. But you can also take a look at Paramita Vora's Unlimited Girls. It's a documentary, but there's an organization that is built by women who have lost their daughters as part of dowry death. So we can see that, and then here we see women of different religions actually coming together, right? So we can think about the homogeneity in terms of dowry death, but the specificity in terms of the religious and class differences therein. So there are definitely instances that lead to organization from this intersectional understanding. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here and there.
Right.
Hello, ma'am. My question is somewhat similar to what she asked, but what I want to ask is, do we have it's about the practicality of something like intersectionality. So when we come to this, do we have some paradigms to decide which are the factors which intersect? Because in a country like India, uh, obviously, gender and caste are dominant paradigms.
Yes.
Still, when we look deeper into different sections of population, they have different concerns.
Yes.
So if we do not have a factor which determines what is the real concern of different groups of people, then this concept of intersectionality would be like essentializing or
Absolutely
exclusionary.
Yes.
So
That's a very good question, in fact. And I'd like to refer that you go to EPW has very interesting articles. One by Nivedita Menon and another response by Mary John. So Nivedita Menon says that India is already quite intersectional in nature. Do we even need this buzzword called intersectionality? And Mary John and Jennifer C. Nash also say that we do. Now, your question is actually very pertinent. That if we are already fixing certain categories and looking at individual groups based on those pre-decided categories, are we also not reproducing the same categories once again and fixing them in it? So the answer to it is in Leslie McCall's method of intersectionality. She talks about three methods: anti-categorical, intercategorical, and intra-categorical. Now let's focus on inter and intra for the time being. So in intercategorical, she talks about maybe pre-decided groups. We go in and then we see how caste and gender are intersecting with each other. Now, while during the course of research, while you are doing the research, you may also come across hierarchies within categories. For example, let's say we are doing an analysis of a lower caste community, and then we find I'm just on the top of my head, I'm thinking of Kerala, the difference in Irawa community and the Paraya and the Pulaya communities, right? There are hierarchies even within the communities, and that can be achieved through intra-categorical differences, okay, or intra-categorical intersectional approach. So when we are doing an intersectionality, it's unfortunately somewhat inevitable that we go with a sort of presumption, but I think we also have to keep our minds open to have that scopes of intra-categorical differences also, and not let ourselves be bogged down by the presumptions, because at the end of the day the presumptions may flip altogether also. So I hope that answered your question.
Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
Lovely talk.
Thank you.
So, I think you mentioned that experiential knowledge is crucial to actually understanding these overlaps between categories, and yeah, that's a very relevant point. But then, one of the criticisms of intersectionality, like you said, is that it relies heavily on identities, and yeah, I think that can be worked out. But uh, in like sociology or when we do ethnographic studies, that is great. We can incorporate like experiential knowledge and evidence to an extent, but do you think it's somehow not very reconcilable with the law itself? Because law abstracts things, and it considers things. I mean, when we think about rape, it needs to be ideal.
Yeah.
Like it needs to be in an alleyway, it needs to be dark, the girl needs to be alone, she needs to be completely helpless. The law cannot beyond a point incorporate this kind of concrete experiential knowledge. So what are the challenges of that, and how can we sort of overcome?
Yeah. So thanks a lot for this. In fact, the problem of experience and the issue of subjectivity is very common. Now, the criticism towards experience is also there. Now, law presents a unique challenge to us, like I said, because it's supposed to be very like scientific in its nature, right? Everything is objective, everything has to be classified, categorized. The only way to change it has been to come up with different kinds of amendments of acts. Okay, we bring in much more nuanced things, especially with Nirbhaya case. There are many more things, but also there are criticisms also in the sense which woman gets or which rape gets recognized, right? So Nirbhaya versus Hathras and other cases. So law, unfortunately, even though it's like the parameter to bring about justice, okay, and this is where justice and punishment becomes very interesting. Who really gets what kind of punishment? When we discuss the text also, I don't want to like say everything right now, but when we discuss the text, we'll also see that who is more susceptible towards getting punished and who is not. Unfortunately, I don't really have an answer, because law seems to be such a necessity, but at the same time it's so so much rooted in inflexibility, if I'm making sense, right? It's very difficult to maybe provide an answer. And the more and it also makes a lot of difference, because when I began that talk, I said that how the judges, male judges and female judges, looked at the rape of a woman very differently, right? So one solution has been, to sprinkle in more women in the decision making processes. But also there is the criticism of, is it really tokenism? Is it really bringing it about a change? So I would say the discussion you pointed at, it's an ongoing debate, and it's very difficult to have a clear cut answer, but it's a very crucial question actually. Thank you for that. Yeah. Sure.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Today we talk about gender discrimination and rape. So when we talk about gender discrimination and rape, like consciously or unconsciously, we also talk about objectification and subjectification of women. And when we talk about subjectification and objectification, the gaze, the concept of gaze, and especially male gaze comes. So my question is, why we are using the term male gaze? Because we are associating the very term, like we are gender specifying, right?
Yeah.
So why can't it be just gaze, or let it be female gaze? Why only male gaze?
Right. So, going back to, thanks for the question, going back to Laura Mulvey's article, in class, I received similar kinds of questions, which is very valid. And I like to rephrase the whole gaze thing and talk about it as patriarchal gaze, right? Because once again, male gaze, going back to the similar old, feminist theorization, older times when men were seen as automatic perpetrators, right? It's going back to the age old thing. But since then, we have moved long way. Now, gender identities are no longer restricted within the binary of male, female. It includes many others. And as going back to the first question, in fact, there are many agents of patriarchy. So I think your question is really very valid, and the correct way of rephrasing it, perhaps we can start doing it by talking it as patriarchal case. Right? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I have this one question. We are all aware of the tropes like fallen women or idle women. Are these terms being critiqued from the lens of caste, creed, and religion? Is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I'll also give more examples in the next, lecture. You can go back and take a look at articles by Sharmila Rage. Would be a great starting point in looking at how this category of fallen woman is mostly caste and gender oriented. There is also Jenny Rowena, Smita Patel, Mary John. There are like Uma Chakravarti who talk about how these notions of fallen woman, vamp girl, are not just rooted in sexist sort of notions, but also in the Indian context, casteist notions as well. So I would highly recommend that you go and take a look at any of these theories. Fascinating research. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say in many cases both actually go hand in hand. I'm reminded of Shashi Tharoor's story, Charlie's and I. It's a very interesting story. I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll just speak about it. So in Charlie's and I, it's basically talking about a lower caste boy who is not allowed to enter the house of the upper caste friends. But the moment, then gradually the story progresses. When Charles becomes an IAS officer, he gets to sit on the chair in the upper caste friend's house and drink water, which was prevented to him. And the way in which the story presents is with class mobility, caste kind of gets erased. But we know that is not the case. So we can question the author also, who is writing such narrative, right? The presumption is really overarching. Yeah.
Literature reflect the ways in which caste and religion reinforce patriarchal power status in the society.
So I mean, it's very difficult to generalize like literature in a sort of general term per se. But of course, there are writings which conform to it, which go against it. So there is a huge variety, I would say.
If there are no more questions, we could probably conclude this session. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you so
Pan.
much.
We look forward to the next
Thank you.
session.
Thanks
as
a
well.
lot.
Thank you so much.